I'm delighted now to introduce our speaker, David Wells. David is married to Alison, and he has three grown children. He began teaching in 1985, and after earning an MPhil from Nottingham University, which is a Master of Philosophy, he joined the Catholic Education Service to provide staff development for Catholic schools. In 2018, he launched David Wells Live and has spoken at over 2,000 global conferences. He's contributed to the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales and has guest lectured at universities and written for the tablet. His latest project is the Pastoral Parish in the Modern World, which he co-authored with Bill Hooch. So I'd like to hand you over now to David Wells.
It's an absolute pleasure to be with you this evening, and just a quick thank you to the pastoral development team who've been working with me on this session. I don't have very long. I'm going to cram a whole day into about 18 or 20 minutes. And so I hope you enjoy this. I thoroughly enjoy this material. So thank you for tuning in this evening. Just to say, it is great pleasure to be working with the Kerry Diocese. Back in the 1960s and 70s, your part of the world heralded a number of wonderful priests who were responsible in some ways to my own formation. So there's a nice sort of symmetry going on here. Anyway, back to the theme. I'm going to divide the next 20 minutes, if you will, into actually 5 sessions. Why is joy important? What is joy? Where do we find joy? What does joy achieve? And should we be joyful in a world of such turmoil and suffering? Is that okay? That's how I've sort of structured it. And the nice thing is, I've got to get on with it anyway. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for listening. And here we go. Firstly, why is joy important? So you're probably aware, if you worship in a Catholic church, that in our communion prayer, you've probably said it many times, that in our communion prayer, we say these words: in your mercy, keep us free from sin and protect us from all anxiety as we wait in joyful hope for the coming of our Saviour, Jesus Christ. And then the assembly replies, for the kingdom, the power and the glory are yours now and forever. Now, in that phrase is something I'd never really thought about. We wait in joyful hope. Do you mind me just asking you, what are you waiting for? And are you waiting in joyful hope? Because the umbrella theme of these evenings is hope, and joy is a cousin, and we wait in joyful hope. By the way, the church suggests that if you go after one virtue, you get all the others in the end. If you go after hope, it improves your joy. If you go after joy, it increases your hope. So are we waiting in joyful hope? Is that your experience? Now, why is joy important? Well, firstly, if you go back to Pope Benedict, and I'm going to quote this a bit tonight, it's a reference to Pope Benedict's homily in World Youth Day in 2012. You can look it up. It is an amazing short homily on the importance of joy. But if you look at that, he says, do you know what we're made for? We're made for hard work. You go, okay. We're made for love. You go, well, that's beautiful. But in actual fact, in the tradition of the church, we're made for joy. And you go, I don't remember learning that. I don't remember being told that. But if you look at John's Gospel, chapter 15, what do we find there? These things I have taught you, that my joy may be in you and your joy may be complete. That's what I want. Complete joy. Excuse me? That's what I want. Now, here's the thing. For people like Ronald Rolheiser, the Oblate of Mary, wonderful theologian, you may have come across him, he reminds us that joy constitutes the inner life of God. If you want to know what God's like, find joy. And that's difficult for us because most of us conceive a God who's a bit grumpy, really. a God who's a bit dissatisfied, and maybe a God who's a bit disappointed in us, maybe a God who says, could do better. Well, finally, in this analysis of why is joy important, go back to that homily in World Youth Day 2012, and you'll find Pope Benedict answers this question. When asked, what is the church for? He replied, the church's vocation is to bring joy to the world. Sounds so simple, but I didn't really get that impression growing up. I don't think people meant to, but I kind of grew up with a kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, there was life and joy and energy and vibrancy. And on the other side, there was truth and earnestness and solemnity and hard work and peace and reflection. If you like, I was sort of split between Friday night and Sunday morning. I had a Friday night world that was all about life and energy and partying, and I had a Sunday morning world that was about thinking, praying and reflecting. But bringing those two things together never seemed to be a prominent homily as I remember it. And then we get Pope Francis, whose first significant document, Evangelii Gaudium, significant in what way? Well, just think about the title, The Joy of the Gospel. And you go, wow. So what is joy then? What is joy? Well, many of the gospel writers refer to anybody who comes into contact with Jesus as an encounter with joy. We see this particularly in the Gospel of Luke. Amazing. Anybody connected to the birth story, shepherds, they're all bursting with joy. Read the Magnificat. It's Mary exploding with joy. Anybody who comes into the presence of this Saviour encounters joy. And Pope Francis writes about that in articles 5 and 6 in Evangelii Gaudium, if you're interested. Joy, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin reminds us, is the infallible sign that God is present. That's what joy is. It just is. And so he reminds us that joy is a key indicator of a healthy spirituality. Isn't that amazing? When I look at the stained glass windows in many of our churches, it doesn't really look like that. How many statues and images do you see of the apostles or the disciples or our great saints actually joyful? And yet what we're taught by the church is that joy is an indicator that you're healthy. Number 3, where do we find joy? If it's so important, where is it? If it's so attractive, where do I get some? Now, here's one of the things I love about Catholic theology. Catholic theology refuses to separate joy from the ordinary things of life. You'll find this in Father Andrew Greeley's book on a Catholic imagination. For Catholics, joy is rooted in the ordinary and the circumstantial. You don't have to go onto some mystical experience to experience joy. And neither do you have to be in a religious disposition to encounter it. You know what we're like, don't you? Well, we're like this over here in England. I don't know whether it's the same in Kerry, but we're a bit bonkers. Do you know, I can almost see us forming a joy committee and making a plan with joy objectives and applying for joy funding and then measuring our success and reviewing progress and establishing some protocols. And before long, we'll have a chairperson of a joy committee and a secretary and a treasurer, and we'll design a course. And then we'll have special agents of joy. It doesn't kind of work like that. How does joy work? Well, now at this point, let's go to C.S. Lewis. Amazing. Surprised by Joy, his seminal piece, in which he reminds us joy is not a possession. All right. You can't find joy. Joy finds you. And so be ready to be surprised by joy. If you don't know it, you haven't encountered it, you're still longing for it, pray for it. Surprised by joy, The Gospels suggest joy bursts into our lives. Our opportunity is simply to have an open heart. And then we read the great poets and the great authors and the great spiritual masters, and they all remind us that the world is charged with the grandeur of God. Gerard Manley Hopkins. You don't need to look too far. With eyes open to the Holy Spirit, you'll find joy in the very ordinary nature of what's already, forgive me, in front of you. Perhaps there are some obvious pointers. It's very difficult not to come into joy when you come into the presence of a baby. I became a granddad last year. I'm about 8 months old as a granddad. That little girl has brought so much joy into our lives, but why would I separate that from spiritual joy? Joy can be found in the ordinary things. Again, Teilhard de Chardin reminds us, true joy never involves avoiding reality. It's there in the dirt, which is why we need to be careful to remember what Pope Francis says. Realities are more important than ideas. If you want to find joy, go out into your backyard, smell the fresh air, and remind yourself that you indeed are alive this day, and this is your day. I know it's very easy in a talk to talk like this, but don't confuse joy with a mood, all right? Let's go to the great saints, St. Therese of Lisieux, who said, don't confuse joy with how you're feeling. Joy sits below that. She reminds us, she says, drill down deeper, little bird. There you'll find your joy. It sits underneath your mood, which is why, folks, you can go to a joyful funeral. Such a thing exists because it's true that our joy lies deeper than our feelings. Number 4, what does joy actually achieve? I know there are some of you who are sitting there as pragmatists and you want to say, okay, Dave, that sounds fair enough, but what difference does it make? And surely if we're after joy, well, we should be able to make a difference. Well, let's take this in context. When Pope Francis was in a general audience back in November recently, he said, a Christian who is discontented, sad, dissatisfied, or worse still, he said, resentful, is not credible. The gospel is not an ideology, it's a proclamation of joy. Now, please, if any of you find cheerfulness particularly irritating, you're probably a bit like most of us. This is not about walking around with a stupid grin on your face. You don't have to be falsely happy. Joy doesn't sit at the surface of things, but it does call upon us to express ourselves joyfully. And that sometimes means recognizing that perhaps sometimes we've preferred moaning and being grumpy and disappointed and telling everybody what's wrong with the world. And then before we know it, we turn up to church meetings and they're all a bit gloomy and sad and everybody's depressed. And you go, you know something? We need to pray for the gift of joy. Because nobody's going to believe us if we're busy giving into the world and giving into despair. It's so tempting. So here's the thing. It's one thing to get together to try and solve a problem. But have you also been to meetings where people begin by saying, can we be joyful? Do we even know how to begin? Shall we encourage one another then to be cheerful, to be grateful for the life we've got, and maybe to rely on a power greater than our own in which to discover our own joy? I say that to you because there are so many unhappy people out there, and they're not going to be persuaded by a church which is rancorous and resentful and disappointed and gloomy and corporately depressed. So pray for joy, folks. Here's the thing. It's one of my favorite Pope Francis quotes. I love this. He writes in Evangelii Gaudium, Article 86. He says, one of the more serious temptations which stifles boldness and zeal, is a defeatism which turns us into querulous and disillusioned pessimists and sourpusses. Sourpusses? This is the first time in 2000 years that the word sourpuss has appeared in Catholic doctrine. Yes, it is. And I was fortunate enough to be at an international meeting reflecting upon this particular document in Rome years ago. And here's the thing. At one point, just before coffee, I said, whoa, can you just turn to Article 86? Do you mind? Sourpuss? What is that in your language? And we went round the room, Germans, Italians, and so forth. My favorite translation was the Spanish, because in the Spanish translation, the word sourpuss was translated into the words vinegar face. Vinegar face isn't credible. No one is going to be attracted to vinegar face. And I know it because it matters. I know that when I turn to the person next to me, seeking the sign of peace, I can tell from their face whether they mean it or not. Even a 5-year-old can spot fake joy. Which leads me to my last question, and I'm keeping my eye on the time, got a couple of minutes. Should we be joyful? When I listened to yesterday evening's presentation, a wonderful erudite presentation about the risks of global warming and the fact that hope has to be hope for the poor, we arrive at a theological dilemma. Yes, we do. Do we have any right to rejoice in a world where there's so much pain and suffering? Do we? Well, wonderfully, in his book Salt of the Earth, Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, answered this question. He says there is a moral attitude at work when we say, should we be joyful in the wake of other people's pain? There is a moral attitude. But he said, nonetheless, that moral attitude is wrong. So how does he counter it? He says, the loss of joy does not make the world better. And conversely, refusing joy for the sake of suffering does not help the poor. The contrary, he says, is true. And he finishes, dig deep and have the courage to rejoice. Dig deep. In an echo of St. Therese of Lisieux, dig deep, little bird. Dig deep in your work for social justice, in your work for an improving world. Don't think you help the poor by being miserable about it. And that's why so often Blessed Mother Teresa and others come over so joyfully. Think about your own communities. Some of the people who have suffered the most are also the most joyful. So joy is a spiritual gift. We need to seek it, pray for it earnestly, and seek that it visits us. For in that we will recover, discover our energy, and join our Friday nights to our Sunday mornings.
Aware of others and aware of the pain, the sadness, the grief, the challenges people are facing, how do I tell my brain to focus on joy?
Wow. You know, isn't that interesting? And that's the spirit at work when people are thinking like that. And of course, what I don't want to do right now is come over as an expert on joy. I'm not a psychologist, but what I do know from the scriptures is that suffering and joy are not opposites. And in fact, you will find that people, in my experience, who know the pain of loss, who have grief, will often share with another person who's grieving, and what they'll experience is joy. Now, I know that's profound and a little bit difficult to grasp, particularly if you haven't been there in life. But most people, I think, watching this or listening to this will know that there is a joy that speaks to one another when we meet each other in suffering. And, I can't account for that. I can't measure it. I can't assess it, and I can't make it happen. But for those people who are watching this now and they're saying, look, Dave, I've been watching the news. I see a president on the other side of the world, and he's cancelling out some of the progress we made. And I feel sad and lost. And the others saying, don't go there. And we get caught up in ideas and ideologies. I know that the great saints of our church and our tradition have been fairly good at staying close to joy. Whatever happens, don't make joy and suffering opposites. And I don't quite know how to go about that.
Well, that's very honest, and I suppose that's our dilemma, isn't it, as human beings? Like another person has put in a question here with regard to being empathic to other suffering, walking the journey with other people, and that would be their preferred stance, to try to pretend or to push themselves to feel joy. But you're saying that sometimes walking that journey with somebody, or I'm thinking of, groups like AA or NA, or, groups where there's a shared pain, but often there's a shared consolation or a shared hope. Would that be true?
I think so, Francis. I'm tempted to ask you the same question, but imagining, that most of the people, probably all of us who are listening to this and trying to engage it, will recognize suffering in their own lives. But I'm going to suggest that the pursuit, particularly of comfort and stability and a suffering-free world, being in that place in our lives when we have no cares, is not strangely particularly joyful. And I've often asked myself, like in our pursuit of the perfect Christmas, has it been joyful? And, you begin to recognize that there's an odd equation going on here. I know in my life that some of the people who are closest to me and have suffered the most have also found a deep-rooted and sincere joy in their lives. Now, I can't calculate that. I can't make it happen for somebody. But I do believe that in our Christian heritage, there is a wisdom here for us. We were not born to be successful or necessarily comfortable, but we were offered joy. And that's, I think, a pursuit that we should go along and wait in joyful hope. I don't think there's an opposite in these things. I just don't know how to marry them.
Okay, and I suppose often we have put them, as you put in your talk there, that Friday night challenging the Sunday morning and vice versa. And in a very real way, somebody has put into the chat box, that challenge to be joyful when somebody has what you desire and you have not received it. So in this case, it's somebody who's learned that they can't have a child. And to be joyful, to be surrounded by people who are joyous at the birth of, as you say, your grandchild or whoever, that's a hard place to be.
Of course. And, how can I speak for that person? But what I am aware of is I'm not convinced that our joy is the same. And we have no evidence for that. So I guess part of my Christian challenge is to find joy in real life, in the ordinary circumstances that I find myself in. And, there's that lovely moment in scripture where Peter is looking enviously at John and says to Jesus, can I have his life? And Jesus has to say, look, look, there's a rope for you that will be put around your waist, and you might go where you'd rather not go, but your joy is to pursue your life. And I guess I please don't let me speak for somebody who feels pain when they look at other people's children. I just want to say I'm not sure that we find joy in the same place. And if I can't have joy where I thought I would, maybe there's hope in looking for it somewhere else.
So does that relate to what you've said about that joy kind of sneaks in if we're open to it? So that we might be pursuing it in one way, but in actual fact, it's about being open to it, and it'll spring up where we don't expect it. And what about people who feel threatened by just the spontaneity of joy, or the delight of joy, or the exuberance of joy?
Mm. Well, my experience of people who've written about it, who prayed about it, who've offered us even mysticism regarding joy, is that joy takes us by surprise, but it doesn't threaten us. None of the spiritual gifts come as an intrusion. Well, they might come as an interruption, but they're not forced upon us. And I think Catholics in particular, or please tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we're a bit suspicious of joyful religion. I think we've been taught to be very serious and earnest about all this, which is why I laugh when I speak to evangelical churches. You know, they're bursting with joy, but sometimes by their own admission, they say we lack some of the depth and the richness of your theology. And it's as if we divorced the two. I would say to people, if you're feeling joyless tonight, or if you're wishing for more joy, I would say pray for it, be open to it, but don't imagine that you can calculate or formulate it. When I look back at joy in my life, it was often not at the sought after times. I just had to be open to it. And sometimes it so deeply moves me, it doesn't make me laugh, it brings me to tears.
Mm.
Mm.
I loved what you said about Luke's gospel and people experiencing joy in the presence of Jesus, or in the presence of God, in their midst. And they weren't expecting joy. They weren't expecting God. They were kind of, as you say, caught off guard. So is some of it, and you mentioned there about maybe we can be trying to order our lives and thinking, well, I've got this, I've got this, I've got this. Now the next thing I want is joy or hope or love. Is some of it letting go of that striving?
Oh, well done. I mean, that's beautifully put, and I think so, don't you? I mean, my gut instinct, in the tradition of the church, the enemy of hope is being a control freak. It's trying to control all outcomes, to calculate them, to measure them, to organize and systematize our faith. The truth of it is, God will burst joy into our lives when God chooses. And our skill is to say, Lord, I'd like some of that, and simply be open to it. But I must say, I don't think there's a joy formula out there.
So maybe just as a final question around sort of imagination. So perhaps our image of God, and you mentioned earlier, might be a bit grumpy,
Mm,
frumpy, frowning on joy.
mm.
What do you, what's the image of God that allows you to kind of loosen that sort of tightness or control freakness and allow God to break in?
Yeah, again, a journey of a question worth a lifetime. But I think the skill is is to be open to joy, whatever that means, to pray for it, but to be open to it and to recognize that there will be moments when it takes you by surprise. And I still don't, I guess I'm fascinated by it because in the brief encounters I've had with joy, one of the hallmarks of it is it's not an addiction. I've met joy. I've almost said hello to it and been deeply moved by it, and then recognized I've got to go to a meeting. I've got to go on. I've got to feed the kids. I've got to get on with my life. But those moments have been quite powerful. And to some extent, they leave a mark, a trace, that I can remember that. I don't need to have it all the time. Um, and if I did, I would be suspicious of it.
I know I said the last one was a final question, but this really is. And I suppose it brings us right full circle to where you began your ministry, working with teenagers.
Mm.
And the question is, how do we encourage our youth to find joy, particularly in the mundanity of school and work, college life and that?
No, that's again, there are many answers to that questions, and many of them would be given by people with more wisdom than me. But I'm going to suggest 1 Peter. I think it's 3:13. I hate throwing biblical quotes at people because, especially Catholics, and over here in England, we don't tend to know the numbers. But I'm going to suggest that I think it's that. But forgive me, some of your listeners will be able to correct me. Where we're reminded, St. Peter reminds us, always be ready to give an account for the hope you have. Now, what I'd like to say to everybody watching or listening to this, if you know what I'm talking about tonight, you should be ready to tell that story. You know, a brief encounter with joy may be a child, it may be a summer's day, it may be the realization just briefly that God whispers into your ear, I love you. It may be simply a feeling of intense being alive. But whatever that is, always be ready to tell somebody else, because that's what the world is looking for.
Well, I think that's a really good place to stop. Thank you, David. And I'm going to hand back to our David. Thank you.
Thank you, David. So we had a final question and a final question. So can I get you to give us your final words?
Oh, very briefly, and thank you, David. Number one, don't let the world steal your joy. All right. Joy is vulnerable. Don't let things steal your joy. Number two, desire it. Ask for it. Seek it out. Don't be satisfied with the ordinary and the mundane. There is a joyful life out there. Number three, learn the art of not taking yourself too seriously. I'm speaking to myself when I say that. I need to be reminded that the world is not on my shoulders. Number four, as Pope Francis reminds us when he talks about St. Joseph, learn to accept, not abuse, but learn to accept the circumstances of your life. You're not called to live the life of another. And lastly, number five, when you see joy, point to it. Make sure that other people see it too. Thanks for listening.